Well, hello, friends. This is Doug Reeves from Boston, and I'm joined by Dr. Howie Knoff, who's going to spend some time sharing with you his latest ideas on planning for MTSS support. Dr. Knoff is internationally known not only because of his leadership in the field of educational psychology, but also as a best-selling author and a prolific blogger on the subject of multi-tiered systems of support and other ways to take care of both the academic and the emotional needs of students in schools. Welcome, Dr. Knoff.
Well, thank you, Doug, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. Hopefully we will be able to give you some very practical information as we proceed and talk about information that needs to be collected and analyzed at the end of the school year relative to students and their progress, and how that data informs you in terms of both planning and preparation for the first day of the new school year. So let's begin. Joel Barker says almost all successful individuals and organizations have one thing in common: the power and the depth of their vision of the future. Well, in terms of making sure that our students are successful, what we need to really do is we need to recognize that education is a tag team marathon, not a series of sprints. More concretely, we don't do a third grade sprint or a seventh grade sprint or an 11th grade sprint and then we're done with the race. Basically, what we need to do in education is we need to tag team from one year to the next, and that means that we've got to look at where we've been, what we've accomplished, and the current status and needs of the students from the end of the year, specifically and in an organized fashion into the new year. And so in order to accomplish that today, what we're going to do is the following four things. We're going to provide a very quick overview of multi-tiered systems of supports and how that is written in and operationalized in the new Elementary and Secondary Education Act. We're going to talk about specifically how to transfer the student lessons learned from the end of the school year into the new school year so that students are getting the services, support, strategies, and approaches that they need on the very first day of the new school year. That's going to be embodied, that transfer process, embodied by the get-go process. This is a process that we've developed and implemented in thousands of schools across the country over 30 to 35 years. It's a user-friendly process. It's a field-tested process, and it's really demonstrated its impact to not only prepare the next year's teachers, but the schools from year to year in terms of being ready to address the needs of individual students. And then we'll kind of look at the outcomes of the get-go process and again, how that relates to multi-tiered systems of supports. So starting out with kind of the biggest picture, the ultimate educational goal is to maximize all students' academic achievement and social, emotional, and behavioral development. And that's probably never been more true in the last 20 to 25 years than it is now, with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act's emphasis not just on the academic proficiency of students, but also on the school and classroom climate and on preparing students on the social, emotional, and behavioral level to be able to function not just in the classroom, but also post-graduation. And so from a student perspective, the ultimate goals, therefore, are from an academic learning and mastery perspective, we're trying to help kids to become independent learners. Now that looks obviously different at kindergarten than third grade, fifth grade, seventh grade, and 11. It's a developmentally bound kind of construct. But nonetheless, I mean, we're all focusing on helping our students to learn, master, and then be able to apply and infuse their learning into new elements of learning. From a social, emotional, and behavioral perspective, the ultimate goal is to teach kids self-management skills. So social self-management, emotional self-management, and behavioral self-management. So as we're both tracking kids and teaching kids over the course of the school year, what we're doing, given today's topic, is we're evaluating at the end of the year the social, emotional, and behavioral development and progress that the students have made, their preparation to go into the next school year with all of its next demands, but also the needs of certain students in these areas in terms of services and supports. The multi-tiered process is a process that focuses both on students' academic and their social, emotional, and behavioral status, but then how it translates into needed services, support, strategies, or programs. And again, if you use a multi-tiered perspective, which is really what we're talking about, we're certainly trying to ensure that all students have the best preparation to be successful, but recognizing at the same time, some students may need strategic intervention and others more intensive intervention. And so as we look at effective school and schooling, that whole multi-tiered perspective has got to be on the table in a very explicit way. And so kind of a rhetorical question is, when you look at your school or your district's strategic plan, is it really focusing not just on the students who are succeeding, but the students who are not succeeding as well, the students that are presenting with academic struggles or social, emotional, and behavioral challenges? Because a sound strategic plan that really is true to the multi-tiered systems of support is going to be looking at the planning, the resources, the staffing, the professional development, the needs of those students at, if you will, the tier 2 and tier 3 levels of intensity, and whether or not the district is prepared to provide those services and supports for those students. And so from that multi-tiered perspective, you see the interface of the academics and the behavior. And that's simply a necessity. Often we ask our teachers in the classroom if they have students who are behaviorally acting out because of academic frustration. And of course, they say they do. And then we ask kind of the converse question, which is, do you have some students who are not academically achieving because of some of the behavioral skills of the students? And they say, yes, indeed. And so that interface between the academics and the behavior is a dynamic one. And it's basically having a sound academic program at the same time, simultaneously, that you have a sound classroom management program. But again, as you see in this diagram, we've got kind of represented the tiers with on and off ramps. And so some students need those strategic interventions in a specific academic or behavioral area, or the intensive interventions in those areas. And that's really where we've got the multi-tiered process that is providing and addressing all students' needs. And so again, from a tiered perspective, our perspective is a little bit different than maybe what some people talk about at the national level, or that some researchers have talked about. For us, the tiers are about an organizational system that reflects the intensity of student needs. And again, there are different definitions or operationalizations of intensity, but the point ultimately is that the intensity of need is driven by the student need. But the other reality is that a well-resourced district may have certain services and supports available at the tier 1 or tier 2 level, and other, let's just say, rural school districts that don't have the resources in hand and on site, they may have to provide those services from a tier 3 perspective because they have to insource or outsource those students. But again, as you saw in the diagram, this is a fluid process. And so if a student comes in, let's say moves into the district, and they have an immediate need for intensive, shall we say, tier 3 services, the student should get them. And so it's not a sequential process. It's not a process that's driven by percentages. It's not a process that's driven by the place of service delivery. And it's not a process that's driven by who's doing the service delivery. That's really either an antiquated kind of way to think, or quite honestly, none of those approaches or thoughts were ever validated. So the notion, for example, of there being 80 to 85% of the students at tier 1, 15% at tier 2, and 5% at tier 3, honestly, those data are epidemiological data that just don't fit in an educational world. The point for a school or a district is what percentage of your kids need certain intensity levels of services. And then a question is, what are you doing at the tier 1 level if you've got 20, 25, 30% of your kids needing, quote, tier 2 strategic intervention? But again, from a multi-tiered perspective, and as we focus on the get-go process, part of the attention is necessarily going to be directed to the students who have those strategic needs and the students that have the intensive needs, both on an academic side and a behavioral side. And so in that context, the goals of a multi-tiered process are the following. One, to use a database problem-solving process when students are academically struggling or socially, emotionally, or behaviorally presenting with challenges, to use a database process that identifies the underlying root cause of why the student is not being successful, and then links the results of that data analysis to research-based instructional or intervention approaches. A second goal is to provide consultation to teachers so that the needed interventions or instructional adaptations are actually implemented with integrity and intensity. A third goal, to collect assessment and intervention progress monitoring data or summative data to make sure that the student is making real progress. And one of the realities here is that sometimes our interventions simply don't work, or they don't work to the degree that we expect them to. And that's where the data is also important, because it helps us to look at the speed of success, but also when we're not having success, it gives us some comparison points for when we try the next instructional approach or the next intervention approach. And then the last goal of the multi-tiered process from our perspective is to increase the knowledge and skills of the teachers and other professionals involved in the case at hand. And part of this is really because we want to transcend the individual student perspective. We want to make sure that our teachers, when we're successful with an individual student, they understand why we're successful, what other students might benefit from this intervention or instructional approach, and then how we would do the implementation on a more independent level. So in other words, what we're trying to do with the multi-tiered process is to solve the student problem at hand, but also to learn something about how the intervention approach could be utilized with students in the future. And so from a multi-tiered perspective relative to our federal law, the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is really about to move into full force. I mean, this year it's been in play, but as we get to July 1st of this year, it's going to be in full implementation. But in contrasting the new Elementary and Secondary Education Act with the past one, No Child Left Behind, there's one major difference. And that is that the Congress has basically transferred much of the responsibility for the development, the implementation, and the evaluation of the academic and behavioral programs that we're implementing in our schools from the federal government down to the state and down to the district. So in a large way, the districts have more self-determination in terms of their approaches to educating our students than ever before, and that includes the development of the multi-tiered services and supports that the students in an individual school or district need. Some other nuances or realities relative to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. One, the Act does not mention in any way the words response to intervention. They're nowhere in the law, and in fact, they were nowhere in the special education law IDEA, which was reauthorized in 2004. And in fact, IDEA, what it says is that we need to look at students' progress or their response, their responsiveness to scientifically based interventions, especially in the area of literacy. But again, from an Elementary and Secondary Education Act perspective, there is no response to intervention. In essence, the multi-tiered system has substituted now for the RTI. Two, the law mentions positive behavioral interventions and supports 3 times and multi-tiered systems of supports 5 times. And this is critical. In the federal law, and in fact in all federal laws, these terms, positive behavioral interventions and supports and multi-tiered systems of supports, these are always in the law in lowercase with no acronyms. And that's a critical point, because in essence, what we need to do as schools, districts, and states is to create our own. We don't want to be taking one off of the shelf, and we don't necessarily have to use the programs or frameworks, PBIS or MTSS, that have been generated by the U.S. Department of Education. They are available, but they are not required. So again, there's no requirement that any state, that any district use the uppercase acronym PBIS or MTSS frameworks. States are free to adopt or create any approach, any model that is consistent with the law. And so let's talk about what the law actually says. Here's the definition in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act for a multi-tiered system of support. It's a comprehensive continuum of evidence-based systemic practices to support a rapid response to students' needs with regular observation to facilitate data-based instructional decision-making. And again, this term only appears 5 times in the law. 2 are actually in the definition, and the other 3 relate to academically struggling, English second language, and students with disabilities. But if you look at this definition that's in the law, basically it allows a broad swath of development for schools and districts. And certainly you have to adhere and attend to the definition, but basically you can pretty much create any delivery system that is consistent with this definition as long as it provides the outcomes relative to student progress on an academic and behavioral perspective that are needed. And so the law again gives the school and the district the opportunity to create a local response to the individual needs of its students. So,
Howie, we've had a question that comes in with respect to the variety from state to state. It ought to be self-evident that New York is different from South Dakota, for example, and that urban districts may have differences from rural districts. So the question is, where is there flexibility, and what have you seen in terms of variation between districts of different types, different needs, and different sizes?
well, the way that we approach this, Doug, is we've generated evidence-based blueprints, and there are 2 evidence-based blueprints relative to MTSS. One is kind of the step-by-step procedural blueprint, so that if a teacher has a difficulty in the classroom, the teacher does this, then this, then this. And part of that process is how do we do the data-based analyses of the student, but who is doing it? Is it done by the classroom teacher, at the grade level team, or by a multidisciplinary team at the building level? And again, these are not just kind of procedural things that we've developed on our own. Based on my past experience as the director of the State Personnel Development Grant for 13 years for the Arkansas Department of Education, we've vetted these processes along. But the point is, as you're kind of referencing, Doug, is that within that blueprint, individual states and individual districts have to kind of work the blueprint to their own best ends. The second blueprint is the database problem solving, is the actual problem identification, problem assessment, linking that to instructional or intervention approaches, and then eventually evaluation. And in essence, the way that we've done this, and I've done it now for over 30 years in every state in the country, is we're in essence taking the scientific method and applying it to academic and social, emotional, behavioral problems. And again, that's more of a science to practice kind of universal. That's not going to vary from state to state, although to be quite honest, there are very few states that really do the database problem solving in the most effective ways. So moving on, again, part of this is the individual schools and districts looking at their student needs, creating their multi-tiered system, and now we've added on kind of the layer of that there are evidence-based blueprints that have been demonstrated to validly guide the process. And then we've got to kind of look at the reality of how do we infuse effective practice into it. And sometimes we're doing that by looking at our resources in-house, but also the expertise out-house. And so one of the things that certainly that we do at Creative Leadership Solutions is we've got lots of national experts that help schools and districts to get down to the nitty-gritty of how do we really make the MTSS process work both procedurally and functionally so that we get the student outcomes that we want. Some comments, Doug.
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. I think the most important thing is and this is several questions now, what really is done by the classroom teacher versus done by people who are specialists in behavioral or emotional or academic interventions. It can be overwhelming for a classroom teacher to feel that he or she has to do all of these things.
And the reality is that the classroom teacher does not have to do that, at least the approach that we take. Kind of the mode of operation that we infuse in the schools that we work in is a problem-solving consultation intervention mode of operation. In contrast with wait for the student to fail, refer, test, and place them, and hopefully then they are taken out of the classroom or receive more specialized services. But the real essence of your question is, Doug, is the skill level of the teacher. Because there are going to be some teachers, general education teachers, who've got a great deal of skill and expertise for certain student problems, and they may not need that consultation as much. But for other problems, they need the consultation. So the key really is to do a resource assessment to infuse through professional development the instructional and intervention approaches that are most needed by the students, and to build a collaborative approach so that if a teacher feels that they just simply don't have the understanding or expertise for a particular problem, that they can go out and find a consultation, maybe within their grade level team, certainly within their building, or at a district level. Doug?
Here's a nuts and bolts scheduling question. To what extent are these interventions provided during the school day, and to what extent are they provided outside the school day?
Well, again, that's going to be on a case-by-case basis, but, when we're building an MTSS system, the real assumption is that we're going to be providing these services and supports during the school day. And as we get into the latter part of our discussion today and talk about the get-go process, what will happen as a function of the get-go or an outcome of the get-go process is that at the end of the year, every school will have a student need map. They will have a resource need map, and then they can go about kind of designing their classrooms and support services to best meet the needs of the students, while then also recognizing where there are resource or intervention gaps that again have to be either outsourced or insourced. So let's move on. Rosalind Carter said, a great leader takes people where they don't necessarily want to go, but where they ought to be. This is not easy work. I mean, we've got students with significant academic and behavioral challenges, to be sure. And we're not going to, quite honestly, solve every student's problem, because there are times where we're actually playing with a 45-card deck. We don't always hold all the cards. We don't have always control over the intervening variables that sometimes are walking into the school and the classroom with the students. We do the best we can, but we can certainly design a system that, in my experience, sometimes is better than what we have. So let's talk about the get-go process. The primary goal of the get-go process is to evaluate the academic, social, emotional, and behavioral status and progress of every student in the school at the end of the current school year. So kind of one of our mantras is the beginning of the new school year starts in April, because if we don't take stock of where the students are in April and May, if we don't strategically organize the resources that they need, or even indeed what homerooms they go into, we may begin the new school year already behind the eight ball, where we may not be able to make some structural changes because the homeroom is already set. And so we're trying to use end of the year data to really prepare in a strategic way for the first day of the new school year. So we want to make sure, second part of the definition, or the goal, we want to make sure that students are placed in the best learning settings and situations for the next school year, again, based on the end of year data. And then we're identifying at the end of May or early part of June for some districts, the students who need specific services, support strategies, or interventions, so that we make sure that they receive those on the first day of the school year. And so from an outcome perspective, what we're trying to do is we're trying to enhance the academic, social, emotional, and behavioral progress of all students by making sure that we're going, in essence, from bell to bell, from the first day of the school year to the last day of the school year, and we're going full throttle. We're trying to make sure that our staff are fully prepared and resourced to be able to meet individual students' needs. And so we want to make sure that the general education staff are receiving students in their classrooms that they can fully be prepared to educate, but also make sure that the students have the resource staff available to them for, again, those strategic or more intensive interventions. And then obviously all of this sums up to a more successful school in terms of not just academic proficiency, but also school and classroom climate and those social emotional interactions that sometimes occur in the common areas of the school. So from the student perspective, again, we want to track at the end of the year the progress of the students so that that informs the students' assignment into the next school year in terms of their classes or their homerooms. And then again, identifying the student supports that are needed so that we can basically align those supports as needed or buy those programs or prepare the staff for the interventions over the course of the summer and into the days and maybe week that occur before the new school year starts. From a staff perspective, we're trying to facilitate staff-to-staff consultation. And so, for example, in April and May, if we've got some students who have some significant needs, we might have available the current year's teacher to talk to the next year's teacher in consultation, even in April and May, so that that teacher is starting, or that teaching team is starting to think about how are we going to provide those supports to the students that have those needs. We're going to look at the assignments of the related services staff, of the remedial staff in terms of the academics and the behavior, so that we're getting those ready at the end of the year for, again, the first year and into this new school year. And then we're going to look at the staff to student training that has occurred at the staff level as to what's worked, what's not worked, what needs to be maintained, and what needs to be enhanced as it relates to especially the students who have Tier 2 and Tier 3 needs. And again, at the school level, we're looking ultimately at the student outcomes, but some other things to get there. We're looking at the ability of the school to really deliver and be prepared to deliver good, sound, differentiated instruction to kind of make this a little more concrete. Many times I go into classrooms at the elementary level, let's say a third grade classroom, and I ask the classroom teacher to tell me the grade level equivalent of the lowest functioning reader in the class and the highest functioning reader, and then how many functional skill groups that teacher has to teach. And invariably, what we get in a typical third grade are kids who are reading at the end of first grade level, all the way up to students in the same classroom who are reading at the middle of fifth grade level. And if the teacher functionally grouped those kids, the teacher would have 5, 6, or 7 different functional groups. The point is that in an effective school, teachers can differentiate instruction when they have 3, maximum 4 functional skill groups in their classroom. If they've got 5, 6, or 7 functional skill groups, there's simply not enough time to either prepare, much less to instruct the students in a differentiated way. At the middle and the high school, we're asking teachers if they know, for example, the literacy, math, oral, and written expression skills of all the students in their classroom. Because, for example, if I'm an 8th grade math teacher, if I don't know that half of my class is reading at the 5th grade level, then I can't differentiate, if you will. I can't modify. I can't do something to the 8th grade math book, that has an 8th grade reading level. I'm not going to be able to know that I have to do something with that 8th grade reading level math book for the half of my class that's reading at the 5th grade level. And so the differentiation at the elementary is a little bit different than at the middle. But again, the get-go process really facilitates the capacity of the school and the potential of the school to make sure that we're putting kids in our classrooms where the differentiation can actually occur. Again, some of the other school outcomes, making sure that we have the resources at the tier 2 and tier 3 level that are needed, make sure that we've got the speech, for example, related service needs, the counseling needs for the kids who have social, emotional, and behavioral needs. And again, all of this is done at the end of the year in preparation for the beginning of the year. Again, as kind of a side note, I want people to understand that we didn't just make this up. All of the things that I'm describing to you have been done for the past 25 or 30 years by me at the State Department of Education level, at the district level, from urban to rural to suburban, at the rural level. And all of these things have been deemed to be evidence-based. We have collected the outcome data. We've presented that data to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and all the way back in 2000, they deemed that the work that we do, that we basically call Project Achieve, is an evidence-based program. And so Project Achieve is on the National Registry for Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, and that basically says to the people out in the audience today that this is not simply something that's made up. This is something that has been developed, has been refined, and has been demonstrated to be something that produces the student, staff, and school outcomes. So again, let's drill this down one more level. The get-go process in kind of its full functionality. It is completed in April and May. It's largely completed by the grade level teachers, along with the administrators and the related service people in the school. What we're trying to do is we're trying to identify the progress of the students on an academic and a behavioral level, and that also includes discipline, referrals to the office, attendance. We're tracking kids that are on medication, kids that are receiving the tier 2 and tier 3 services. All of that data is put together in a spreadsheet that I'll show you in a couple of minutes. But what we're trying to do as kind of the bottom line of the process is identify students at the end of the year as either get-go student, at-risk student, check-in students, or no-problem students, again, based on data and based on a consensus of the people who are around the table at the meeting. And so again, get-go students, and by definition, and this is our definition, get-go students are students who need immediate interventions or may need immediate interventions on the first day of the school year. At-risk students are students that have had some fairly hefty instructional modifications or interventions this year. They don't need them on the first day of school, but we want to make sure that next year's teachers are briefed by this year's teachers so that if that student starts to veer off, that next year teacher knows basically what to do and how to handle it. The check-in students are students that need a safety net. And obviously, we're hoping and expecting, and typically, we have somewhere between 70 to 85% of the students who are no problem students, but that's going to vary from building to building. So, one more drill down, the get-go students. The way that we have framed this, again, as a get-go student needing immediate interventions on the first day of school, what that means to us is that students who are on IEP or 504 plans are immediately and automatically get-go students. And again, this is critical that we're identifying this at the end of the school year in preparation for the next year, because the next year's teachers are going to know before the school year starts which get-go students have IEPs, have 504 plans, and we're going to make sure that those plans are delivered to the general education teachers and that the teachers as needed will be trained to implement those plans prior to the first day of the new school year. But again, as a kind of a different variation on this theme, sometimes we will identify medically fragile students as an example as get-go students. So if I've got a student with a seizure disorder, and God forbid the student has a seizure on the first day of school, we've got to make sure that the classroom teachers and the support staff are prepared, especially if the student moves from 5th grade to a new 6th grade building. We've got to make sure the staff is absolutely prepared to be able to handle any kind of an emergency medical situation, and that also includes the bus drivers as an example. So again, we're prepping at the end of the year for the new year because God forbid, again, something happens on day one, we want to make sure that we are able to provide those medical and other services to the students. The at-risk students, as I said, what we're doing is we're making sure that the next year's teaching team is briefed on the interventions that have been implemented in the past, how they've worked, why they've worked, and what they can do to kind of keep an eye on the student so that if the student begins to need those same interventions again, that next year's teacher is prepared to do it. Now, one of the ways that we facilitate this briefing process is we ask the classroom teachers, and we do this for both the get-go students who are not on 504 IEPs and the at-risk students. All of those get-go students not on IEPs or 504 plans and all at-risk students, we have the teachers in April or May write a briefing paper that basically delineates the critical information that the next year's teaching team needs to know about this student. And we have a template for that, and we're happy to share that. But the issue is that the teachers really do not leave the end of the year. They're not, they're not checked out, if you will, by the administrator until the briefing papers are done. Now, some people may get a little bit nervous about this and say, all right, well, teachers are not going to do this. And quite honestly, when we are training and discussing the get-go process with the buildings, we've never had a building with teachers who say, I'm not going to write a briefing paper, I don't have to do it, the union says I don't have to do it, or what have you. Because the issue is this, it's a pay it forward. So as a teacher is writing a briefing paper for their colleague for the next year, it may be that at the next grade level down, the teachers there are writing a briefing paper for that same teacher. And so the pay it forward principle is kind of prevalent here. And ultimately what happens is that everyone is more successful because of the process. And that's especially true when teachers are being evaluated on student progress. We want to make sure that the teacher has on the first day of school the ready to go process so that they can be most successful. The check-in students. This is, again, a safety net. So the team really decides what the check-in is going to be about. It could be an attendance check-in. It could be simply a check-in because we know that that student has some family issues and want to have the counselor check in the first day or two of the new school year to see how the summer went. We've got kids with homelessness, kids with trauma. We've got kids, again, with the academics who we fear may lose more than the 2-month summer bump down, and we want the teacher to be aware that sometimes they're going to kind of put that safety net out and make sure that they're tracking that student's progress, especially over the first 3 to 4 weeks of the school year. So again, the get-go students, we're specifying at the end of the year what the kind of focus of the get-go, the safety net is. And again, this is all on a spreadsheet that's on typically a school's shared drive. And the classroom teachers who receive the new students simply scan the spreadsheet, or they're given paper and pencil kind of documents about the different needs of the different kids. And so the teachers are kind of ready to roll and prepared, and even for the check-in kids to lay that safety net down. So some of the data, and I'm not going to read this slide, we're certainly happy to make these slides available to people, but what we're doing in preparation for the get-go meeting is we're collecting all of the data that is most critical to know about a student and his or her progress in a spreadsheet, or sometimes we're using the data management system to be able to collect all that data in one place. One of our good corporate colleagues is Illuminate Education, and we've done a number of webinars with them relative to the get-go process. And what they're able to do, they are a company that basically helps to install data management systems into the school and the district. And what they're able to do is to take the data that exists and simply pool it into a get-go spreadsheet, so that we have, in essence, a one-stop shopping center, a one kind of snapshot of all the students at the grade level. So again, you can see some of the information that's needed here. We're collecting, obviously, the student's name, grade, and teacher, the IEP 504 status, English second language. Eventually, we're asking the classroom teachers to pre-identify the students before the get-go meeting as a get-go, at-risk, check-in, or no problem. We're importing the data on grades, GPA, subjects failed, especially at the secondary level. We have the teachers estimate the students' reading, math, written expression, skill level from a beginning, middle, or end. So a third grade teacher would say that Johnny Jones is at the middle of second grade in reading, at the end of third grade in math, at the beginning of third grade in writing. And so all the students get an estimate based on data from the teachers of their current academic functional skill. Certainly, we're importing the progress monitoring, the interim, the formative assessment data, the absences, tardy homelessness patterns, vision, hearing, speech, discipline referrals, medication, mental health services, and so on. So again, we've got this
Howie,
one.
Here's a question from one of our participants. Our school has more than 25% of students that are either 504 or IEP. Do all of these students get classified as get-go students?
Yeah, they would be get-go students because at the very least, and I don't want to play this card too heavily, but by law, the IEP is there and the 504 plan is there for full implementation, 180 school days of the school year. And so those would be get-go students. And again, it may be that all of the services on an IEP are being delivered by the special education teachers, but the general ed teachers need to understand the disability-related needs of the students and how the disability may impact in other non-targeted areas. And so, yeah, they would be get-go students, but again, the service delivery would be driven by the IEP or the 504 plan. But again, relative to the 504, the vast majority of 504 plans are implemented by the general education teacher. And so we don't want to have happen what sometimes does happen in schools where 4 weeks into the school year, a counselor or administrator walks into a teacher's classroom and informs the teacher 4 weeks into the school year that 3 of his or her students are on 504 plans. And so again, part of this process is to make sure that we're paying it forward, but not just in preparing the classroom teachers, but on behalf of the students and their academic and behavioral progress. And so again, once we get the data system up and we're able to import the data, everybody's got access to the data, but then the data are being utilized in the actual get-go meeting. So let's talk about, again, the last drill down, the get-go meeting. So we've got the spreadsheet. We've asked the teachers to pre-identify students as either get-go, at-risk, check-in, or no problem. And what happens at the very beginning, maybe even the first thing at the meeting, is that the grade levels meeting together. So it's a third grade team or a sixth grade team or an eighth grade team. It gets a little bit more dicey at the high school level, and you're going to kind of have to mix and match who's at the get-go meetings. And sometimes, quite honestly, at the high school level, it's the student services team or the student assistance team with the administration that's doing the get-go process with some input off-site, if you will, or out of meeting by the classroom teachers. But again, let's stay with the third grade example. So the third grade team is there. And let's say that the third grade team actually rotates the students. So some of the teachers are teaching literacy, some are teaching math, some are teaching science and social studies, but the homeroom teacher has identified the first list of no problem kids. So the first thing at the meeting is that list is presented to the classroom teachers. And so let's just say there are 60 names on that list, and the third grade teachers have said, all right, these kids don't have any problems as they're transferring into the new school year. Well, what would happen is from that, quote, consent agenda, if any teacher around the table, administrator or related service person didn't agree and they thought that 2 of the students on the consent agenda needed to be discussed, then we just pull them off. But again, the point here is that if, for example, 75% of the students are no problem students, we're getting the no problem part of this agenda done in 3 to 5 minutes, so that we can then focus the rest of the meeting going through the remaining student names and identifying their get-go, at-risk, or check-in status. Some other things that happen is sometimes we have decision rules so that certain kids are red flagged prior to the actual get-go meeting. So for example, relative to chronic attendance. Chronic attendance typically is where we've got students that have missed 10% of the school year. So what we would do is on the spreadsheet and then generating a list of students for the meeting, we would identify any student who has, let's say, 15 absences or more. Okay. So we finalize the no problem list. We then go through all of the students relative to the get-go, at-risk, and check-in status. We then identify the needs and areas of the students specific to get-go, at-risk, and check-in. And then we start talking about how we're going to utilize the data. And again, it may sound like this meeting takes forever, and it really doesn't, because what we're trying to do is once we get the consent agenda out of the way, we're only going to spend about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes on each student. All we need to do at the get-go meeting is to say, you know, Johnny Jones is an at-risk student in the area of math calculations, that Mary is a check-in student relative to attendance because she's been red flagged, that Johnny is a get-go student because he has a bee allergy, and everyone needs to know that right at the beginning of the school year. So again, this is not to solve the problem of the students at the table. This is to identify that they have had problems, identify the needs, that the resources that we've applied to their needs this year, and then to project the needs that they still have or may need to have as we get into the new school year. So this get-go meeting, you know, honestly, if you've got three teachers with 25 students, 75 students, most of the time we're getting this meeting done in an hour to an hour and a half maximum. The briefing report, here are the sections of the briefing report. Again, we usually provide this as a template that is online so that we're able to maintain both the security and the longevity of the report over time. But basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that the briefing report has the security and the longevity that it needs, and it's easily accessed, not just to the next year's teacher, but to maybe future teachers where the student is continuing to have difficulties. The content, basically, you can see on this slide, the background of the student, the critical factors that we need to be focused and attentive to, the student's strength and progress, as well as their weaknesses and the underlying reasons if those have been discerned, the successful strategies or interventions that we implemented this year that need to either be maintained or modified as they move up to the next grade level, perhaps a list of the strategies that were not successful so that we don't go to that well again, and then the keys to helping the student to be successful and other information of note. And again, typically the briefing report, because it is a briefing report, is really about 3 pages once you get in and fill in all the different boxes. Doug, any thoughts?
Yes. So here's another question. To what extent do these meetings result in student movement between categories? For example, from get-go to at-risk to no problem?
Well, I mean, if we look at it from a year-to-year perspective, certainly some students are going to be moving. But again, we don't typically bring into the 3rd grade meeting the spreadsheet from grade 2, because obviously 180 school days have gone by. But again, if we're looking from a systemic perspective, that's really kind of an interesting thing to think about in terms of, are we making progress with these students through, especially, again, the strategic and intensive interventions. And again, you've got the data if you're doing this in multiple years. And I've got systems that have been doing this now for near a decade. And so we can look at kids who are in 10th grade and where they were in 2nd grade. and really look at, in a systemic way, the progress over time, not just for the individual student, but for the groups of students as well as for the grade levels of students. So that's a great question.
Well, Dr. Knopf, I want to thank you very much. This is really challenging and important work, and I must say it does seem like a lot of work, but I suspect from your experience it's even more work if you don't do it right the first time.
Well, I mean, if we don't have the right resources aligned to the needs of the students, and if teachers are getting frustrated because they don't have the capacity to be successful, then yeah, it does take an awful lot of time. But again, what we have found is that the time invested in this at both a school and as well as a district level is time well spent. And let me give one concrete example. I've worked in a lot of large systems, Doug, as you have. And sometimes what we find is in these large systems, they're almost run like a little feudal system. And so we've got 5 or 8 or 15 different elementary schools in the same system. And what they've done is they've kind of amassed all of these resources, people and software and interventions and professional development. But because it's a feudal system, they dig a moat around the school and they're not going to share. And one of the basic kind of strategic planning and systemic principles that we practice is that the resources follow the students. And so if we've got an elementary school that's got some very needy 5th grade students, and they're going to the 6th grade level, then the resources need to somehow follow those students into 6th grade and into that new building because the needs are still there. And sometimes what happens in the kind of converse way is that students who have been in a school have critical needs that we didn't really know about from the very beginning of the process. And so what happens is we may have some more needs for the new school year than we have resources this year. And what happens in, again, a systemic level with the get-go process is that the building administration, because it's done this work in April and May, they can go to the district level and say, you know something, we may need another half-time school psychologist here, or another half-time reading specialist, or another half-time speech pathologist. So that, again, what we're doing is making sure on the building level that the needs of the students are prepared for during the summer from a resource and a resource allocation perspective.
Well, I want to thank you very much for participating this afternoon, and also thanks to all of our listeners. If you'd like to contact Dr. Knopf directly or share this webinar with your colleagues, we'll have this available, posted as a free download at creativeleadership.net. You can also click on the Contact Us button, and we'll be happy to set up a conference call with Dr. Knopf, myself, or any of our other staff as well. Thanks very much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.